Everybody for joining us. I apologize for the slight delay as we were getting underway. I'm honored to be here. I'm Vago Muradian. I'm the editor of Defense News and an Atlantic Council, proud Atlantic Council member. And I'm honored to be here to discuss the new report by Barry and Bilal. I will dispense with introductions, and our schedule is relatively easy and straightforward. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get a discussion started, and then open it up to the floor as well. Seeing some friends, old friends here, as well as hopefully some new ones. The report is Artful Balance: Future of U.S. Defense Strategy and Force Posture in the Gulf. I have all sorts of questions to start out. Artful balance, and I mean, Barry, I'd like to start with you. What's wrong with the current strategy that we have? Ultimately, why is it time for a new strategy? And what does that strategy need to look like in sort of the near, mid to long term?
Sure, and thanks for being here, Vago, and thanks to everyone. And if this is a public event, so if you're tweeting, the Atlantic Council hashtag is AC Mideast, just to get that out of the way. When I, 11, 12 years ago, when I was in the Pentagon and we oversaw a very significant redesign of U.S. military posture in Europe and in Asia that is still continuing today. And to my mind, that was the first time there was a change in military posture based on a strategy and based on regional objectives for our country working with our allies. Instead of just a residual sort of set of bases from previous conflicts or from previous arrangements. We never could get to CENTCOM. They were quite busy, as you might recall, in the 2003, 4, 5 timeframe. And so while we have very effective forces and a strategy guiding those forces, it's our sense, Bilal's and mine, that there is enough going on in the world, there's a lot of change, that we risk a very significant misalignment in what our forces are doing and in the nature and mix of the forces that we have in the region. We have a much more constrained defense budget than we have had in years past. We have a very significant priority that I think will be sustained by any administration focused on Asia and the significant security challenges that are coming up there. We have a proliferation of technologies that we're just starting to see the beginning of that will that will cause greater disruption, greater instability, greater individual empowerment, where we'll see non-state actors using these technologies and even state actors using some of these technologies in ways that we haven't anticipated before. And we have the makings of a major deal with Iran on its nuclear program or not. And so if you take any of those factors, it certainly calls for a reassessment of the bases for U.S. strategy in the region, but also for the types and nature of our military presence. So short answer, a lot going on, and it's been a very long time since we thought about the architecture of what we seek in the region with our partners and the military forces to underwrite it.
What are the core interests from your standpoint that the United States needs to be defending or advancing?
In the report, we list those. Among them certainly are dealing with protecting U.S. forces, working with our allies and partners to protect common interests, protecting the free flow of energy, continued free flow of energy, and dealing with counterterrorism. And I might have missed one or two, but this is an interest and strategy-driven suggestion, not just what forces do we want where.
Right. Bilal?
Did I miss one, Bilal?
I think we have a huge interest also in promoting the political development of these partners.
Of the 4 sort of core pillars, right? Deterrence, reassurance, counterterrorism, and
I think political development is right up there as well. I think the United States has done a very good job pursuing the first 3, but if I were to put political development as the 4th, I'm not sure it's been a priority for a very long time. And because the United States understandably has been focused on near-term security and near-term stability, this has sort of been at the bottom of those priorities. I think that they understand it is a priority, but what the United States has done in the region has not really reflected that. And so I'll tell you why it's important. It's not just just the same old approach of, well, we need to reform because it's the right thing to do. It's just also because it directly relates to the first three interests that you just mentioned. Internally strong and stable partners help counter Iran's destabilizing role in the region. There's a lot that the use of force can do, and there's a lot that military assets can do to deter the Iranians from further destabilizing the region, but I think a major antidote to that is a politically stable, internally strong partner that can help the United States do that. Because political fragility is something that the Iranians would always pry on, right? And so I think it's about time that the United States, in conjunction, working very closely with its partners, really tackle that issue very seriously, because for a long time it's been pretty much ignored.
Let's get, there are a bunch of questions that I've got, but let's get, both of you have mentioned Iran. Iran is obviously very topical. We've got one more day on the deadline to get a deal, or at least an unofficial deadline to get a deal. P5+1 continues to negotiate. Walk us through what happens either way. We get a deal, because obviously it's a country that still has an enormous amount of conventional military capability, very dedicated build-up, exceptionally good at copying U.S. technology. You note in the report how smoothly the Iranians managed at least to replicate the Scan Eagle that they ended up with. A lot of asymmetric power as well, with the Shia crescent that King Abdullah has talked about throughout the whole region, King Abdullah of Jordan. Talk to us about what happens. We get a nuclear deal, and what does that mean? We don't get a nuclear deal, and you have a nuclear Iran, and what does that mean? Which you guys have said would be extraordinarily, sort of an extraordinary event that would have to precipitate a fundamental reconsideration of U.S. strategy.
Let me make a broad statement, and I think it gets to the title of the report, which is Artful Balance. People are wondering, well, what does that mean? I think for a long time, the United States has pursued a set of objectives in the region that are often competitive. They work not very much in harmony with each other. And I think the United States will never reach perfect harmony. I think what it will have to do, and it's been trying to do that for a long time, but perhaps not very effectively, is to balance between competing objectives. And it's an artful exercise, and I'll just mention a couple of balancing acts that the United States is currently engaged in, and it will continue to be engaged in the future. So when you want to reassure partners and you want to deter adversaries, going too far in one direction could undermine the other objective, right? And vice versa. Let me just make an example. When you have such a preponderant and massive U.S. military presence in the Gulf that is primarily designed to deter the Iranians from coercing or attacking the Gulf partners. And you have, a set of missile defenses, stealth aircraft, obviously a good amount of U.S. soldiers. That's all very good for deterring conventional capabilities on the part of the Iranians. But I'm not sure that that set of means will affect or guard against Iranians' asymmetric approach. And I don't mean asymmetric, air denial area, A2AD capabilities. And I mean really this ability of the Iranians, which they have honed for a very long time, to create and work through proxies, right, in the region, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it's Hamas or other actors in the region. They've done that so well.
In Syria.
Right, exactly. And to a certain extent, Houthis in Yemen. That will continue to be a problem for the partners. And for a long time, they've been pretty much emphasizing that to Washington, telling them very clearly that as much as we are concerned about the Iranian nuclear program, I think our more imminent concern is what the Iranians have been trying to do, which is destabilize the region through these proxies. And so I think that the United States has done a pretty good job with the assets that it has deployed to deter the conventional stuff, right? But I'm not sure that they've done a very good job, or they have an answer to the asymmetric approach that the Iranians have pursued, and there has to be a balance between the two. Give you another example, and then we can get into what happens with deal or no deal. There's a good amount of U.S. soldiers in the Gulf. That's not a secret. In some ways, that detracts from the counterterrorism objective of the United States. And let me explain why. The narrative that Osama bin Laden used, and he was quite unhappy with the U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, is something that should be kept in mind. And obviously, this shouldn't lead us to make a recommendation the United States should adopt a purely standoff, long-range posture, completely remove all the soldiers from the Gulf. But I have a feeling that that kind of opposition to a preponderant U.S. military presence, especially with the soldiers, maybe down the road would become a little bit more mainstream, right? Not just from the radical and terrorist leaders, but more within the Gulf societies. Now, I'll be very clear. It will vary from one Gulf country to another. Some Gulf countries are pretty much comfortable with what the United States has deployed on their territory. Others, not so much. So I'm always very careful when I make an observation about the Gulf countries. There's clear difference between the Saudis or the Kuwaitis or the Emiratis or the Omanis or the Bahrainis, right? But there needs to be a balance moving forward in terms of what is the right amount of U.S. soldiers to keep there to continue to fight terrorists, right, in and outside the region, but also be sensitive to that narrative that a preponderant U.S. military presence with this amount of U.S. soldiers might actually exacerbate the terrorist threat.
And that's what you mean by, impairing, U.S. forces can actually impair long-term
Yes.
U.S. aims.
Yes.
Barry?
I'll just add one point to Bilal's and then address more directly the second part of your question. I mean, even when I was working on these issues, when I was in when I was in the Defense Department working on basing issues, one of our premises was, militaries don't mix very well with societies. And the example that the Secretary of Defense used with me, he said, if there was a German armored division in Central Park in New York, the New Yorkers wouldn't like it. That said,
if they're defending, as a New Yorker, if we were defending them against Brooklyn, that's perfectly fine by me. But you were saying.
They just don't mix well. That said, I think we don't want to shrink from a healthy, sovereign military relationship where forces from either party are hosted either permanently or rotationally, on either party's territory. But I do think we need to be sensitive to this question. And so, but I don't want to give anyone the sense that we're saying, okay, well, Osama bin Laden said it's a bad idea, so let's retreat. So that's not the case at all. On the question of an Iran deal, I think there's been a lot of heat and light on this question. And I think either way, as our report states, we need to rethink our strategy and arrangements. If there is a deal, for instance, then most, but not all, of the sanctions, of the economic sanctions, will be lifted from Iran, and the economy will be more integrated. And the security elements of the Iranian establishment will have more funding. And some of those security elements, indeed many of them, are extremely hostile to the United States and to our Gulf partners. And so the Quds Force will get more resources. The IRGC will get more resources. And these are entities that don't exactly, work well with others, and certainly don't certainly have extremely antithetical views and conduct extremely hostile activities against the interests of the United States in the Gulf. So even if there's a deal, we still have a lot to deal with. In fact, we may even have more to deal with, or at least different. If there's not a deal, depending on how that outcome comes about, then we have other sets of challenges. And so I think it's really important to think through in some detail different scenarios associated with this central variable as we identify in the report, and what the attendant implications would be for strategy and for military posture.
And
yeah, I think the biggest statement in the report, which will be controversial, but I think it's about time we make it, and we do make it clearly in the report. Even in the event of a deal with Iran on the nuclear front, I think it might be time that the United States would seriously consider upgrading the security relations it has with its Gulf partners into an actual alliance. Those who would be willing. We're not talking about U.S. GCC as a whole, but willing Arab Gulf states. Now, in many ways, you would tell me, well, we've had those alliances for a very long time, and there's nothing new about that. Actually, that's not true. The United States, and I'm always unclear about the Israeli case, so I'll just put that on the side. With the exception of Israel, possibly, the United States does not have a single ally in the Middle East. It has a set of partners. Now, you might say, well, there's semantics. There's a legalistic differentiation, and it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference in the real world. At the end of the day, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States didn't really need a mutual defense treaty with the Kuwaitis to intervene forcefully and kick out the Iraqi army. And I'm sure that in today's environment, if the Iranians were to attack any Gulf partner, the United States would come to the rescue of the Gulf partners. But we feel that given this particularly, I would say, uncertain and decreasing trust between the two sides, the United States and the Gulf partners, I think it might be time, and given the set of challenges that Barry just described, the worsening security dynamics, I believe, after an Iran nuclear deal, I think it might be time for the United States to consider extending a mutual defense treaty to willing Arab Gulf states. Now, I don't say that lightly, neither does Barry. I think there's a lot of risks in such a proposition. I think there's a lot of unknowns, and I'm not sure that the other side would be willing to entertain such an offer. And obviously it will have some sensitivities, whether it's within the United States Congress or even the executive branch itself. But cost-benefit analysis, and I think we make that clear in the report, the benefits outweigh the costs. To prevent further regional instability that may result after an Iran nuclear deal, that, by the way, all the Gulf partners find extremely problematic, in addition to the Israelis and the Egyptians and the Turks. So pretty much not Iran in the region. To prevent worsening security dynamics, something like that, a mutual defense treaty that would be the ultimate reassurance to the Gulf partners, would be in the strategic interest of the United States.
Well, why not upgrade the entire GCC to a much more NATO-like organization that turns it into that sort of deterrent force? Everybody likes to chew on NATO, but it's better than any other alliance that we have.
Well, obviously the United States should try, but I think we should be very clear that the GCC is a highly imperfect organization. And so for them to really work closely together as a NATO alliance is something that, let's just say, it's going to take more than a week.
Correct. Understanding the challenges associated with it. But look, there are a powerful array of interests. You brought Israel into this. I mean, the rhetoric that you hear coming out of Jerusalem is very, very similar to what you will hear a lot of the other countries say, and there is common cause between Israel and many of the countries in the Gulf, Iran being a unifying element. There are other strategic reasons for that from an Israeli standpoint. But if you look at it, you have a series of allies or friends or partners that have very, very different strategic aims sometimes, right? The United States wants a two-state solution. Israel doesn't want a two-state solution. It's more honest about it, I think, now than it's been in the past. If you look at it, the United States had some very serious issues with how the Gulf states were supporting radical elements, both in Libya and in Syria, and we've seen how that turned out. How does the United States posture and operate in this sort of setting where its partners and the United States sometimes do not appear to be strategically aligned in what it is they want to achieve? For example, the United States wants to denuclearize Iran without a conflict, whereas I think there are guys in the region who, for a variety of reasons, do not want any deal that normalizes anything with Iran, that allows a lot of Iranian oil to hit the market. It takes away a unifying element that you can take away from marshaling your population against an external threat. I mean, there are a whole bunch of factors in this.
I think there's an essential sort of commonality of interests on the most significant challenges, on the long-term questions and the like that we address in the report, that suggests we move towards what I would call discovery on the question of an alliance. I mean, we suggest this concept and way ahead after a lot of analysis about U.S. objectives, Gulf partner objectives, challenges, opportunities, and how they all might likely play out. And we do scenario discussion on the question of an Iran deal. You know, if you look at any of our bilateral or multilateral alliances that we have and that we have had for decades, you know, there's no exact commonality of interests on every single type of issue, be that the way Japan views the question of managing China, be it the various levels of military capabilities and will among our 27 NATO members, where, you know, as we were discussing earlier, you know, someone says NATO's, you know, not a very strong alliance, but, you know, they've been failing for 60 years now. So there's something to it. And so I think
it's better than not having them, right? I mean,
correct.
So
I think the standards...
Before we sound like we're being too tough on NATO.
We don't want to raise the standards of an alliance to levels that are above our current relationships. But I think that the challenges we're facing in this region are going to be long-standing enough that our relationships with many of our partners, in some cases, go back to the 1940s in the Gulf. That I think the conditions are right that we should have this national and international conversation right now about one of the most solemn commitments that sovereign nations can make to each other, and that is coming to your mutual defense. How do you define that? What are the specifics? What are the command and control arrangements? What are the political military consultation arrangements? What's the supporting sort of specific military posture, I think, is our analyses and discussions that we should have in the coming weeks and months. And I know the Atlantic Council will be conducting those analyses and convening those discussions, but I think it's time to not shy away from this structural question. When we were struggling with our operations against ISIS, we're struggling with the nature of our arrangements and challenges in the wake of a deal or no deal with Iran. There are internal domestic questions, I think, in some of the countries in the region, including our partners, but also in some of the states that are failing, like Syria, Yemen, Libya, Iraq. I mean, and the list just keeps growing. And so I think it's time to step back, and this is what our report suggests. Step back, take a look at these situations, discuss our assumptions about the nature of the security context with our close partners, and decide how do we want to go forward in terms of our relationship. Well,
yeah, just in case this was missed or wasn't clear enough, I think it was in the summer of 2009 when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually mentioned a defense umbrella in the event extended to the Arab Gulf states in the event that Iran would obtain nuclear weapons. I think what's different in this report is that our timing is actually right now. It's not after Iran would get a nuclear weapon. So just in case.
Would you suggest make it easier for the administration to sell a nuclear deal up on the Hill, right? Because you could say that I'm making this strategic.
As part of a package, exactly, to shore up regional stability and prevent the Iranians from thinking that they are now the sheriff in the region, that they actually have license to bully their neighbors, and this would send a very strong message that is not the case at all.
Interesting use of the word sheriff. It's basically we're stuck with that. It's not that any deal is a bad deal. It's just that either way, the deal carries with it enormous price. Not doing it carries an enormous price, and doing it carries an enormous price. So what's sort of the best managed outcome?
Yeah, I mean, well, my view is that a good, I mean, this is a little tautological, right? A good deal is the best outcome. Well, what's a good deal? And you can go on and on and on. But I mean, I think the key question is regardless of that outcome, as we discussed in the report, the United States has enduring interests and security commitments in the region. It's not a region that's going to go away, regardless of our domestic energy output, regardless of what's going on in Asia. I think as this administration has learned since January of 2012, when it was suggesting to focus primarily, if not solely, on Asia in terms of security. And so in light of those assumptions, which I think people should debate, how should we go forward at a political military level and at a military posture level, and in the relationships with various partners in the region and outside the region, because there's also, I think we haven't discussed the roles of some of our European allies who also have relationships with key Gulf partners, and over time the role of China, which is growing as they get more of their energy supply from this region. I think their interests are going to grow, and so how do we grapple with that question?
Right.
How does China increasingly approach the region? These are really strategic issues, and our main thought here, in my view, is to be modest. I mean, we're not saying an alliance is the answer, and so now let's go forward and start negotiating. I think my hope from this is that this report begins a conversation where a public conversation, an official set of conversations, we want to raise this issue instead of getting into the tactical pieces only, and even the operational level pieces, as our ISIS war game did a month ago. I think the key question is let's address the core question of the nature of our security relationships with our partners in the region. I think that's the right level of analysis that the nature of the trends and challenges in the region deserves.
Bilal?
I'll speak for myself. Barry might have a different viewpoint. I think this is a very good deal on one condition, and this is what we address in the report. It's obviously a very good deal because it reduces the chances of weapons of mass destruction proliferating in the region, even though it doesn't entirely solve the proliferation of nuclear materials problem, right? We're just managing Iran's capacity to enrich and not really eliminating it. So the contingency is this, is you actually pursue, if you follow it up with actions that deal with what we've been talking about, which is this asymmetric threat that Iran poses. If you actually start to get serious about that, then you have a much nicer deal that you can sell to the partners. The perception is, and it's a pretty strong one, that after this, we're done. We did our job. We achieved our goal on the most important priority, which is weapons of mass destruction proliferation. And then after that, whatever Iran does, we'll make a few adjustments to our approach in the region, but we're not really going to get very serious about that. So with that, yes, it's a very bad deal, but it's a very good one if you get serious about your follow-ups, right? You follow on actions, and then you show the partners that you're actually very serious about them.
Barry?
I think
Do you, as you look at, one of the issue with U.S. forces in the region, let me go there for a second because I've got, I'm interested in what you guys' thoughts are because you do spend time in the report talking about it. So you say that too often in Washington the discussion is sort of, is it two carriers in the Gulf One? Is it the right kind of, do we have the, right amount of people or the assets sufficient? And you're saying that all too often what's missed is whether the right kind of assets are in the right kind of places.
Right.
What are the right kind of assets the United States has to have there? Looking at your report, one might think that naval aviation and sea power would be one of those things. But what are some of the kinds of things we need to have over in the Gulf region, and where do they need to be in the Gulf region?
Kidding aside, that was totally random. We just really discovered that like a few minutes ago, that we had the F-18s and then the carrier, and it was primarily all Navy. But
John Greenert will send you a postcard thanking you.
So the bottom line of the core principle that should be driving this redesign of the posture is as follows. I think for a long time we've been focusing on capacity, so numbers, right? Let me be very clear. Numbers are very important for this deterrence reassurance equation, right? Size is important, but what's been underappreciated is capability, and you mentioned that. Instead of saying how much more or how much less we should have in the Gulf, which has pretty much dominated the discussion about posture in the region, we should be saying to ourselves, what should we have there and where, actually? This is my personal view, and again, Barry might disagree. I'm not sure what purpose F-22s serve in Al Dhafra Air Base. We're not going to be engaged in dogfights with the Iranian Air Force. For me, what's far more important is capable law enforcement, internal security forces that shore up the stability of those partners. Now, again, missile defenses are extremely important, obviously, for deterrence of potential Iranian missile attacks, and that arsenal is improving steadily and it's growing in number also. So it's no joke, but I'm far less concerned about an adversary that is much more inferior on a conventional side of things, and obviously I'm talking about the Iranians, than on, again, I keep sounding like a broken record, than on what they do with their asymmetric approach. I think there needs to be much more emphasis on those internal security forces, and there's going to be a lot of training, obviously, with the United States. There's going to have to be a lot of emphasis on how the two sides work together, real training, and there might have to be a conversation, a serious one, about what is the real purpose of having that many U.S. soldiers in Kuwait, a ground presence. The good thing about it, you don't really see them if you're in Kuwait. But it's an honest debate to have in terms of what the real purpose is of such a large contingency on Kuwaiti territory. They might have to be relocated somewhere else. I mean, those are just general thoughts. We get into more detail in the
there's more detail in the report, and it's literally operational/tactical. But I think a couple of the attributes that I would cite are the need for sort of a more diversified and agile presence. I don't want to get into sort of apple pie type attributes, but I think that's really important because of the growth of Iranian capabilities. I worry a little bit about over concentration of certain U.S. assets in a couple of key places. In the Gulf, that could be, single points of failure, but not to put it that
Bahrain being one of them.
That bluntly, Bahrain, Qatar, and then I think there's also some suggestions there for different types of forces, more small, fast attack types of capabilities, more maritime relatively. So we're suggesting, without going into the detailed unit level, we're suggesting the nature of the attributes of capabilities that we think are relatively at more of a premium than other capabilities. And I don't think Bilal was saying that we're going to station law enforcement assets there, but I do think there is room for increased cooperation on those types of issues.
Their own and training them together.
Back to the
premium on access, if I forgot to mention, sorry.
Right.
This is something that also is very important. Physical presence is obviously very important, but the access is something that CENTCOM shouldn't be very shy about, telling its partners that this is perhaps as beneficial as any other aspect of our posture. Access is critically important.
Getting back to the hybrid threat for a second, and you sort of hinted at that in saying that there should be a greater law enforcement capability there. What is the best way to deal with a hybrid Iran that is using all of its proxies in the region to cause as much trouble as possible from their standpoint? Obviously, it's fixing a problem and being intellectually consistent, but with the idea of the exportation of revolution. What is the best way for all of the countries and the international community writ large to deal with that end of the problem, which is potentially as destabilizing as any form of conventional weaponry?
Well, you need a political commitment. It starts there. And I'm not sure it's there today. On a more operational side of things, and this has been discussed in various other analyses, you certainly need more intel cooperation and intel sharing. Whether it has to be integrated or not, I'm not sure. There's a lot of sensitivities there. Within the GCC, obviously, it's not at a high level in terms of integration, but that's a very good start. Intel sharing and intel cooperation.
Barry? Do you think, though, does some sanctions regime have to continue then on Iran, whether or not it strikes a nuclear deal or not? That some of those will have to be geared toward the lifting of the nuclear-related sanctions and all of the things that were put on by the Security Council. But do you need at some future point to consider, okay, well, you guys aren't, as you said, there's going to be an overwhelming sense after this is over with that this is over, that the international community did what it could. It did engage the way it can engage, and now it's, how do you bring Iran into the fold, the international fold, which is something that the Iranian leadership wants. Like from an Iranian standpoint, I don't want the word Iran to always be, equal to being troublemaker. It's a proud nation with a very, very long history, so you don't want to always be known as the bad guy. And so there's a part of it that's driving this. Do you think that a nuclear deal could drive the Iranians to take a somewhat more less confrontational role region-wide as part of a global sort of charm offensive? And then if they don't come to that conclusion, what can the international community do to compel them in that direction?
Look, it's possible, but it's really hard to ignore the evidence of
the decades-long track record.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. The record speaks for itself. It's not unthinkable, but it's very unlikely. For a very long time, the Iranians have not respected the sovereignty of their neighbors. They've been very active in extending their reach violently and indirectly throughout the region.
All around the world, in fact, right, with bombings that have happened.
Yeah, but far more effectively, I think, in their own neighborhood. And this, IR literature or whatever it is, I mean, in many ways it's understandable. It doesn't mean you actually, do nothing about it. This is their own way of projecting power. They understand that they're very vulnerable, and this is one of the better ways for them to extend their influence. And the tragedy is that there's been no answer to it, just because there hasn't been a commitment.
I have a slightly more forceful view. I think there are extremist elements among the theocracy in Iran. I don't think deal or no deal, and I have high hopes that President Rouhani will help to change the balance of power within Iran, and I think if there's a good deal, that might help shore up his position and his agenda, which I hope succeeds, because my understanding, I'm not an Iranian expert, but that the Iranian people are extremely pro-Western and could ultimately share more values than the regime in Iran. But let's not make any mistake that there are extremely strong and very hostile elements in the regime that don't show any sign of going away. Expansionist, aggressive ideology. They conduct and sponsor terrorist activities on a global basis. They proliferate capabilities that have military applications to bad actors. They cooperate with North Korea on nuclear weapons issues, and the list can go on and on. So I don't think, let's hope that there's a fantastic deal on nuclear weapons. This is still an extremely hostile regime that will continue to sponsor activities and conduct them themselves in ways that will try to damage Western interests and those of our Gulf partners and those of Israel. So I'm not sort of naive about a nuclear deal sort of ending the challenge posed by the theocracy in Iran. And so until that regime changes its core orientation, we're going to have a set of challenges for some time to come.
But haven't the Iranians bolstered their hand? I mean, folks have a tendency of forgetting that the first aircraft to, friends of mine have told me the first aircraft to land, in Iraq bearing equipment and weapons was an Iranian C-130 or an Iranian transport plane. And ultimately, if you look at the support they're giving to the Shia militias, they're playing a front and center role, right? I mean, top military commanders have been, if you can believe the photographs photographed in the field, actually helping direct the battle. I mean, ultimately, if you're Iran, don't you get tremendous leverage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, ultimately, whether you like it or not, even if you have to pinch your nose? Rinse yourself off in disinfectant? I mean...
Look, there's a specific...
It's a tough crowd here.
There's a specific issue set having to do with the campaign against ISIS on which you could potentially say our interests tactically align. But I think even there, I think that their role, while somewhat valuable, one could argue that their role, while somewhat valuable on a purely tactical basis on taking out ISIS targets, might be aligned with that of the U.S.-led coalition. Again, I think that's a net. I think their role is a net negative for the U.S. and the Gulf, and indeed even potentially for Iraq, because if they continue to reinforce a government in Iraq that's not inclusive of the Sunni population, then it's going to perpetuate the problem. And even if they're successful in destroying this version of ISIS, version 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 will be even more virulent, even more capable, and will come back to bite all of us. So I don't think their role, even if it's militarily useful on the ground in Iraq, is necessarily sort of the beginning of a détente between Iran and the Western-led coalition.
Let me introduce China to the dynamic. I mean, it was, over the years, obviously China's, playing an increasingly assertive global game, and increasingly savvy global game, whether it's, not just in Asia, but across Africa, in Latin America, as well as in the Middle East. And I sat with a senior UAE official once who was chiding me and saying, we don't supply any oil to you. And maybe our real partner is China. We supply a lot of oil to China. China doesn't give us a hard time on a lot of stuff. Maybe we should be allies with them. A friend of mine, the State Department's response to that was, go ahead and let's see if the Chinese ever defend you if anybody attacks you like Iran. I think it was indelicate perhaps on both sides how that was put. But ultimately, what's China's role in the region? And what's the best way to address it?
Well, that's the topic for a fall seminar. But I can sort of give you that's a large and I think also an enduring strategic question that has to do with how China sees its own roles in the region, as well as the U.S. and the Gulf. So it's at least a three-part, very big question. I don't see anytime soon any question of the alternatives to the U.S. security role in the Gulf by any other country, sort of period. And I think regardless of the further development of energy trends, it's a global market in general, and any major disruption to energy flows coming out of the Gulf will affect the global economy and therefore China as well as the U.S. So I think we shouldn't get too hung up on the particular aspects of that. I think the key question for the medium to longer term is, as China's military capabilities continue to grow and as its other interests continue to grow in the Gulf and in the Middle East more broadly, what diplomatic and military roles does it seek for itself? And then how might the United States use that as an opportunity to work with China to conduct common military tasks? That has pluses and minuses at a military level, but I think that's sort of the nature of how I would frame the question. While China has been active in the counter-piracy task force and in evacuating a large number of its citizens from Libya a couple of years ago, I don't see China coming anywhere close to the capacity, the military capacity, as well as the political diplomatic capacity that the U.S. can bring to bear to help work with our partners in the region to solve common challenges.
Yep, that's very well said. And here's another delicate balancing act between, the U.S. can't do it alone, and perhaps the Russians also, to secure the Gulf. There's still a huge gap between those two. And we addressed that briefly, where, in many ways the Chinese are free riding in the Gulf because they're the ones enjoying the benefits of energy, except that it is the most dependent on Middle Eastern gas, but it is the United States that's providing security, and they're the ones who are actually far less dependent. So is there a time for a more strategic dialogue between, or perhaps it's trilateral actually, the United States, China, and the GCC on Gulf security? I'm not sure. But it goes back to what Barry was saying. There's an issue of desire on the part of the Chinese, but also an issue of capability. And so, before those two factors are actually clear, then it may not be really, it may be premature to discuss a more overt and visible Chinese role in the waters of the Arab Gulf.
But that's classic Chinese strategy, right? Take advantage of the global system while at the same time denouncing the global system and saying, it was something that we're not a part of and oughtn't be a part of. With that, let me open to the floor with questions. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, and we will do the best we can to answer your questions, sir. Oh, yes, she's getting the microphone, and she's. Although with such an intimate setting, you should feel that you could shout. No, I'm just kidding.
Oda Aberdeen. During this discussion, there wasn't enough emphasis on trade and economics. If you look at U.S. trade within the Arab region, especially in the Gulf, I estimate there are 4 million Americans who go to work every morning because of these markets, much more so than oil. So that's an important interest that we need to address and enhance. Also, when we talk about internal stability, it's economics that matter. If you have economic growth, if people have jobs, that internal stability will be enhanced. And therefore, we have to bring into account the economic dynamics in many of the Middle Eastern countries. Those states that have jobs, that have economic growth are pretty stable. And this threat there comes really from the external forces rather than from internal disturbances.
Right.
And your affiliation, sir, was?
I am an investment banker.
Investment banker. Very good.
Do you want to take more, or should I?
You can. Oh, okay. I will take.
might
She
forget
wants to
my
piggyback
comments.
off of that question. So
Here comes the microphone. And if you could hold it to your mouth during the whole question.
yes.
Am I holding to my mouth
Online
now?
audience.
Okay, here we are. So, okay, so two quick
And
follow-ups.
identify
Hi,
yourself,
Nawaz,
please.
analyst. So, on the Iranian question, I just want to understand the Shia connection. Like, it looks to me that the Sunni states do not want Shia presence in the region, period. I mean, it's not an Iranian thing. You look at the Shia, how they're treated in the Gulf, whether it's in Bahrain, in Yemen, Saudi Arabia. So how does that factor into the Iranian question? Second, assuming that we have a deal with Iran, we will curtail, supposedly, their nuke capability. And we are already guaranteeing the security in the Gulf. Why do we need to do more if after all the years of training and capacity building with the Gulfies and with all the weapons that we sold to them, that they still can't defend against Iran? I'm just curious how, like, what we were doing with all the billions of dollars that we spent in the Gulf. Thank you.
All right. Let's take those two, and we've got about half an hour worth of discussion left, I think. So we've still got some time. So let's who wants to take the first question?
A couple of comments on the excellent remarks by Ode. You know, what we were thinking about, and this is something I remember that my colleague, Ambassador Richard LeBaron, mentioned to me as we were writing this. You know, when you talk about a U.S. defense strategy, you wonder what the limitations are of your analysis and how much economics and politics you bring into your analysis. And it was inevitable that we would have to bring in the political development aspect of it. Now, obviously, we mentioned as a core interest the freedom of commerce, but you mentioned more specifically the improvement of trade relations and economic relations between the two. It might be a little bit beyond the scope of this particular paper, but I will address a little bit more in detail the internal stability because it relates to political development. You know, political development can mean many things, and I think we mentioned that in the report. You know, it could range from modest political opening into, you know, nation building. So start from scratch to really modest reforms. And it will vary, obviously, this is no secret, from one country to another in the Middle East. And even within the Gulf, political development means different things, I guess, or is at different levels. But overall, at the risk of generalizing, which I always try not to do, overall, political development in the Arab Gulf in that particular context is less about political legitimacy and more about political performance. Now, what do I mean by that? In cases like Egypt, I would say Libya, Yemen, clearly Syria, 80% Iraq, some would take it all the way to 100%, there's a clear question of political legitimacy. So you got to start from scratch, and you have to come up with a new social contract. I'm not sure that's the case in the Arab Gulf. I think that clearly there's an issue of performance, and it gets into the delivery of basic services, particularly to constituents, we say in the report, living not inside the capitals and the urban areas, but to the rural areas. People who are much more vulnerable to I'd say radicalization, and perhaps even if it takes it to the next level, to political violence. And so on that issue of delivery, on that issue of performance, and on that issue of making sure that as wide a margin of population is actually invested in the politics of the country, that to me, and I hope I'm not incorrect in my assessment, that to me is the case of the Arab Gulf. There are far fewer people questioning the legitimacy of the rulers, but there are more questioning their ability to actually deliver. And once again, it will vary from one country to another, right? I think that the plight of Emiratis and Qataris is far better than the Saudis and Kuwaitis, I'd say. Same with the Omanis. But I thought it was a core element of the U.S. defense strategy, and again, for the issues that we just raised earlier, that we thought it would be very important to raise and elevate in that list of priorities moving forward. Maybe just a quick point on the Shia issue. I can't speak for the Iranian government, obviously. I'm not sure what the intentions are, and I can't speak as accurately as far as the perceptions of the Gulf states and whether they want Shia people or not, but it doesn't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a pretty sizable Shia constituency in the Arab Gulf, and they're not going anywhere. So I'm not sure what I can add to that conversation. You know, intentions, you know, they can desire whatever they want, but you know, that constituency is there, and there has to be some kind of, you know, I don't want to call it reconciliation, but clearly better addressing the concerns and the rights of Shiite minorities, whether it's in Saudi Arabia and other places, to, you know, to shore up the internal stability of these countries. But beyond that, I'm not sure what I can add to that, frankly.
I mean, just on Otis' excellent question. I mean, the scope of the report was really focused on the, you know, what I would say is, you know, the pointy end of the spear. Although, as we could tell from the last conversation, we sort of nod towards dealing with questions of root causes of some of the challenges, in particular the extremist challenges. So this is if this was all that the U.S. and its allies and partners did, it would be insufficient. There have to be a full range of other instruments and activities. But this was focused on defense. But I do obviously agree with your suggestion that it's a question of jobs and domestic vitality that also ultimately play into the outcomes that we all seek in the region.
Very briefly, can you give us a thumbnail? One of the things you do in the report is you go by country and you talk about some of the challenges that they face. Do you want to quickly go through the region and talk about, very quickly sketch out some of the challenges? You know, you mentioned Oman, perhaps one of the more pressing challenges there in terms of succession, but perhaps start there and kind of whichever of you wants to take that.
I think Oman is better off than the other Arab Gulf states in terms of just finding peace with itself and knowing what its role is, and it has a lot to offer for the region. And obviously, the key question is what would happen, you know, should Sultan Qaboos depart the scene. And my understanding is, maybe my information is not 100% up to date, but my understanding is that the Sultan has just arrived back home, and so he's back to Oman, at least according to my Twitter feed. I think for that country and others as well, the primary challenges will always be governance related and economics related. And I think every single one of them will face the challenge of economic diversification. And this is no secret, obviously. Some are doing it far better than others. But Oman is definitely facing the challenge of shrinking oil revenues and also a growing population. They have a very interesting region that will contribute a lot to their future economic development, which is Duqm. For me, this is their ace in the hole, and this is their joker card. But it will take some time before investments actually come in large numbers. In my understanding, the United States is very interested in that region. You know, Bahrain, I think, I would argue, is in the toughest spot politically. And there has to be some kind of reconciliation between, you know, going back to the issue of the Shiites there, especially that they are a majority. But I would caution not to adopt the often simplistic narrative, which is this is a Sunni minority government against a Shia-led population, and given the sectarian dimension of it, there will never be the process will never move forward. I think that underappreciated in that story is the very subtle but active Iranian involvement within, I would say, elements of the Bahraini opposition, because there's a lot of elements within the Bahraini opposition that are actually nationalistic, and they mean well.
But there are others that aren't and don't.
Exactly, and then in trying to figure out who's who is a tough challenge for the government, but the problem is that the government has made it much worse in terms of moving forward, because they have adopted an almost purely security-focused reaction.
Which can be very ham-fisted.
Exactly.
Has been.
I think the UAE and Qatar are better off than the rest. But again, the challenges of economic diversification apply to them as well. Small populations, they understand that very well. So training their own people has always been a priority. Every single leader from those two countries has emphasized that in their public statements. They understand that challenge very well. The Saudis, they're a huge country, and I would say the most important partner of the United States in the Gulf. We had some concerns about the transition, but boy, was that done so well, and the transition was so smooth. And as a matter of fact, King Salman has set up or laid the ground for a generational change in terms of leadership. We will still have to obviously monitor that process, but it's been quite an impressively well done effort on his part. And there might be a few changes in terms of policies here and there. I'm sure he's brought his own team, and I'm sure he has his own worldview. But overall, the transition has been relatively smooth. I'm leaving someone probably. Kuwait. Kuwait has an interesting mix of domestic discontent, but also a healthy dose of political reform and parliamentary politics. Right? Stuff is moving in Kuwait,
Which
as
is the challenge.
as opposed to other places. They have a demographic problem in terms of what to do with the Palestinian contingency there and the naturalization issue. But there's a healthy dose of parliamentary politics, which is a very smart way for the Kuwaiti royal family to ward off instability, right? And so, while hardly perfect experience of political reform, I think there's something to be learned from that. And I'm not saying it'll be a perfect fit for the others, but this is something that is worth looking at. Because as I say, this politics is moving in Kuwait, unlike in other places in the Arab Gulf.
Ma'am, you put your hand up just a moment ago, and the microphone is headed toward you.
Thank you. Slowly. My name is Francis Cook. I'm at the Ballard Group. I've worked on Gulf security for the last couple of decades. I have some questions about methodology and just a few comments on some of your assessments. I think I'll start with the assessments. We've been working on ballistic missile defense out there on and off for the last 15 years. That's hardly new, nor is the fact that we've been focused on naval assets, including counter-mine, for at least the last 15 years since the Fifth Fleet was stood up again. It's all a challenge for all kinds of reasons, including the difficult relations almost every country in the Gulf has with Saudi Arabia that would lead the GCC, which you pass over very quickly, if at all. I wanted to ask you some questions. I think another big challenge now, which you do touch on, but perhaps should focus more on, is the growing problem. It's been a problem with NATO for years. It's getting to be a big problem with the Gulf. This whole question of releasability. People in the Gulf tell me that that's the primary reason for the huge French success, as well as Kemble's unfortunate visit at IDEX most recently. It's not the equipment so much as what we let them hang on it, which is what they're particularly interested in. That's a problem that's going to get a lot worse, and I think should have probably more highlight in this. In terms of methodology, it's not clear to me that you traveled to the Gulf in writing this report, or that Gulf militaries had an opportunity to comment on the draft, which I think would have made it stronger and would have prevented some editorial problems which are in there. For example, Thumb Rate is in the middle of the desert. It is not a naval air station. which I think if you'd had the Gulf militaries look at your draft, it might have made it a stronger product. I don't disagree with where you're headed, but I think a lot of what you're recommending is what we've been doing in 15 years. But we keep getting distracted by various crises in the region, which are don't cease, ISIL being the most recent one. And I guess the final thing on political stability is that I think we're going to go through a change of probably in 3 of the states within the next 5 years of new heads of state. And in absolute monarchies, you just can't predict how that's going to come out.
Which states do you have in mind?
Well, the ones where they're elderly or ill. And so I think that it's just very, very hard to focus, as I don't disagree with you on political development, but when that's the backdrop to what we're working with, it has to be done with great delicacy, I must say. But methodology, if you'll talk about that a bit, it would be useful. This report's long overdue. I really applaud your effort in doing it, but I just want to know how you did it. Thanks.
I think you mentioned that we didn't travel around the region. Was that one of the assumptions that you made?
No, I said did you. I don't know if you did
Oh.
or not. If you asked the government to comment on the draft.
I think we did, as far as I remember. Yes, several countries, multiple times. Did we ask them about the draft? To be honest, no, we didn't. I understand that the UAE has adjusted its policy recently. I'm not sure if others will follow. But I bet you that not too far from now, I think that they will take that issue much more seriously, and I think that they will follow the lead of the UAE. But, I mean, you mentioned that yourself. That doesn't mean that the challenges all of a sudden will disappear, or that the foreign conscripts and the armies of these countries will also disappear. I think that you still have a healthy dose of Pakistani and perhaps Moroccan and Jordanian contingents working alongside the locals. I'm not sure what else to add to that. Is there anything new in what we propose? Look, I mean, the fact that we've faced a lot of challenges meeting those objectives doesn't mean that all of a sudden we should, scrap them. I think that we've added some nuance and some detail into those recommendations that have been, we've been trying to pursue for a very long time. But, what was, I think, new and that hasn't been mentioned before is this idea of this formal alliance with the Gulf partners. Other than that, I'll leave it up to Barry if I missed anything.
Well, I think I would make sort of 2 points. I mean, I take your point on the information and classification issues. It is a big issue. It's constrained current operations. It's the kind of issue among another 6 or 12 that I think would be more prominently discussed in a follow-on analysis that looks at, okay, so how would you go forward in this direction if you so choose, if you thought that was the right thing to do? I haven't seen sort of a fundamental rebasing of the capabilities, posture, access that looks at it from the perspective that we did. So if you didn't see as much new, maybe that just means that everything that CENTCOM is doing is perfect in every way. I think there are some aspects of the report that are different, and our government partners have said it's sorely needed. So we're happy about it as a first step, but I think a lot more could be done in a more detailed and a more sustained set of analyses that address some of the issues that I started this discussion with, the very rapid regional political developments, regional security developments that keep coming almost on a weekly basis here, the technology developments that are being incorporated into militarily useful capabilities by potential adversaries, state and non-state alike. And you could add to this list. So I think, as I said at the beginning, my humble intent in publishing this was to sort of set the table and to start the types of conversations that I haven't seen as much in Washington or in other capitals as I think that the moment in history that we are currently living in warrants. So it wasn't meant to sort of be the last word, it was meant to be the first word.
Harlan?
I'm Harlan Ullman. I've taken with your title Artful Balance because I think in a interesting way it underscores the fundamental dilemma that you're dealing with. That is to say, to what degree is this going to be an Arab-centric, or what degree is it going to be an Iranian-centric strategy and change, and how do you balance that? Along those lines, the notion of trying to turn the GCC into more than it is right now is far from new. John Kerry was pushing that since he was a senator, and I don't know what contacts you've had with state, but you may just want to follow up. I think it's going heavy going. But what I didn't see so far is you already have a coalition of 62 states and a smaller coalition of 20 that are banded against the Islamic State. Have you given any thought to using that coalition either as a surrogate or a reinforcement for what you would like to do with the GCC?
Well, I think that coalition has come together around a problem, albeit likely a very long-standing problem, but a specific problem that has come up now. And I do take your point that I think there are useful potential connections that could be built upon to further this question of an alliance against an array of security challenges. But it's not the kind of, I think it lacks the kind of staying power and intent and implications that our thought of an alliance would bring. There are other challenges that undoubtedly will come up that have nothing to do with ISIS that the coalition then would not be as relevant for. But I take your broad point that sort of there may be some good stuff there that can be built upon, but I do think the sort of central core question of a formal defense commitment after, in some cases, 70 years of a long-standing relationship, I think that has a meaning at the political military level and could potentially have significant beneficial effects at the military operational level that a sort of coalition of the willing brought together around a specific adversary in time might not have.
I think I forgot the issue of releasability that the lady mentioned. We probably talk to the same people. I mean, I think that clearly that's an issue on their part, and that's a continuing concern. You know, they ask for something, by the time they get it, the price changed and their circumstances changed, so the relevance of their ask probably has decreased. But, you know, let's just give credit where credit is due. I think this president has committed to reforming the export control process more than any other president. And so is it perfect? Of course not. And I'm certainly no expert on what the details of this process are. I've sat in multiple meetings for DITSA folks and DSCA folks trying to understand it. I don't understand a word. And I'm not sure many of, you know, the highlights of what's been reformed, you know, the bullet points, I'm not sure everybody in the Gulf understands them either, you know. And so there's clearly here also an issue of communication and how to actually better inform your partners about what's been done lately, but clearly it's not what, you know, it's not what they're looking for. It's not clearly it's not perfect.
I think there's, maybe I misinterpreted your question. I think there's two issues. There's one which is the agreements to share classified data on operational matters that I sort of think of as in the CAOC and other places, and then there's this question of releasability for weapons sales and everything else. I mean, Bilal was being very diplomatic. I mean, I will be much blunter. I cannot imagine how difficult it is to deal with the United States when you're trying to acquire military capabilities. I think we greatly underestimate how much that hurts our alliances and our security relationships at every level at which we conduct those relationships. And we are going to start to see more Chinese relationships. I mean, I'm saying this from a narrow U.S. perspective now. We're going to start to see the costs of that if we don't get our act together. And I really worry if Hillary Clinton and Bob Gates get together and say, this is something we really want to do and push behind an initiative, and it doesn't really lead to the outcomes that they seek, we're in big trouble. But I think this is a growing issue, an issue of growing, not just irritation, but it diminishes our influence and our capability when we're working in coalitions It really needs to be changed, and it's an issue that I think should garner increased attention.
It's changing, but it's still a challenge. The system has dramatically changed, so it's not as acrimonious as it used to be. Allies still want capability at the end of the day, and they feel that when they don't get it, they get very frustrated by it. And even some of America's closest allies have wanted, whether it's with remotely piloted aircraft and certain strike capabilities off of their Reapers, and they don't get it, and they get very frustrated. But it's a complicated process that has a lot of hands in the jar as well.
I think QME's relevance has decreased over time given the new circumstances in the region, but that doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. I think it's still a huge factor in U.S. decision-making when it comes to that.
But ultimately, if you look at the kind of capability the countries in the region have, it's some pretty cutting edge. I mean, the best F-16s in the world are in service with the United Arab Emirates Air Force. Yes, sir.
Thank you. John Finney from the National Guard Bureau. I wanted to ask a question about your proposal for a mutual defense pact with the Gulf states in the context of our long and costly involvement in Iraq and in the context of the continuing turmoil in the Middle East region. I would welcome your assessment of the receptivity of the U.S. government and the U.S. public to committing to a mutual defense pact in this region at this time. We all remember CENTO during the 50s, but I would welcome your assessment. Thank you.
Yeah, this alone, and we will convene on this in coming months and weeks, because you raise an excellent and important question that you might imagine we thought about as we were developing these recommendations. I start from the essential premise that it's not a region that the United States, even if we want it to be very narrow about our own very specific national interests, it's not a region that we can ignore, withdraw from, or disengage from and expect good things to happen. Maybe in a world that's less globalized, where flows are less voluminous, et cetera, that might have been a possible dream. But in this world, if we don't help engage, work with our allies economically, diplomatically, militarily, and in other ways, in ways that are sufficient to deal with the challenges and opportunities that are presenting themselves and unfolding, then we will be forced to deal with them, likely in circumstances that are not as favorable. So I start from the premise that robust U.S. engagement, not just military but otherwise, is essential if we are to deal with these challenges on a strategic and sustained basis. If you take that assumption as the first one, and if you agree with that, then the question is, what types of arrangements, given all of the other factors, including global responsibilities and global military capacity, although still significant demands in other regions on the United States, including in Europe now, which were not extant even at the end of the last Defense Department strategic review. That means what are the tools that we can bring to bear at all levels to better deal with these challenges on a sustained basis? And so those are sort of the two assumptions that drove us, in my mind, to make this suggestion that a mutual defense treaty, which would need to be underwritten by in-region military capabilities as well as those that could be deployed from other regions in a crisis or contingency, those would be part of the package. But it's our view that that type of commitment is important. So to get directly to your question, are we war weary, and the whole line that we hear from the White House over the last the last 4 years, in particular as it regards to Syria, yes. But I mean, we elect our leaders to exercise leadership in circumstances that may not be those that are most favorable to what they know needs to be done, time and time again. And so that's where it's incumbent upon our leadership, political, military, diplomatic, and otherwise, to talk to the American people about why these types of actions might be in our national interests and why they may lead to reduced threats, reduced terrorist threats, greater economic opportunity, and you could go on and on. But it's our view, in essence, that An alliance would serve to better link our societies at all these levels in a way that the current commitments just don't bring to bear.
We've got about...
Can I just add very quickly?
Yes.
I think we are at a stage, and it's not going to change anytime soon, in terms of U.S. strategy in the Middle East, where we don't have good options, we just have less bad ones. And so from that perspective, we are very clear about the drawbacks of such a proposal, but we're also clearer about the benefits that outweigh the bad.
It's always about the lesser of two evils. Yeah. We're going into the lightning round. We've got about 8 minutes, and so there was a hand over here that I want to take. Then I want to go over here to Dave, and then to you gentlemen. So let's go over here, and state your name, state your affiliation, and we'll try to be brief and shoot as many of these questions as we can. Please.
Sure. James Souza, State Department. So I know you had mentioned that political development is obviously, in the Gulf states, one of the core interests for the U.S., but I think the question really is, how does the U.S. leverage its defense relationship, to that end? And my second question is, the other suggestion you had made about the U.S. working more actively with, the internal security forces in the region. There would appear to be a difference in terms of, how we understand and how the Gulf states understand what their internal threats are. I mean, there seems to be a trend of, using counterterrorism as a pretense, for cracking down on political opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood, various things like that. And so, I mean, does training, would that be enough to really solve that, I guess? Yeah.
Okay. And now let's get Dave's question here. This gentleman right here.
Thanks, Vago. What does a mutual defense treaty give the Gulf they don't already have? The Carter Doctrine has never been superseded or renounced. It was exercised more robustly than anything NATO's ever done with the recapture of Kuwait. And the United States has already shown that it's not willing to get involved in this sort of internal security stuff because, for the reasons the gentleman just said, human rights, et cetera. So what are the practical benefits from it? Doesn't the status quo, in effect, give them everything they're already going to have?
Okay, and then that gentleman over there. Unfortunately, the other gentleman who was going to get the mic right after this gentleman left, so go ahead.
Keith Hill, Bloomberg BNA, and I'd like to follow up on the last question, but come from a different direction. If you can, could you talk about the effect of sequestration on the establishment of a defense coalition in the Gulf?
Take it away, Barry.
Well, I'll answer the easiest question first, which is the last one. Sequestration is a form of, I'll just sort of jump right to it since we're out of time, is a form of cutting the particular line items in the defense budget in such an arbitrary fashion that it is as divorced from strategy and policy as you could possibly consider. And so our suggestion is that a treaty arrangement wouldn't necessarily mean a lot more forces to underwrite our commitments. It would just make the commitments more meaningful. And so let me get to Dave's excellent and important second question, on which, as I said, we were hoping to begin the conversation here, and we'll stimulate a range of analyses here and elsewhere. It's my sense, and especially from working in the Pentagon as Dave has and as others have, that the most solemn international arrangement you can make in terms of United States security policy is a defense treaty, a mutual defense treaty, to come to the defense of the other party in cases of aggression or attack. That is the most structural, solemn, and forceful bureaucratic vehicle that one could use to cement an arrangement in terms of military plans and capabilities, as well as in terms of political commitment and reassurance. And so for all of the reasons that we discussed in terms of the flux in the system, countries failing almost by the month, a way to structure the arrangements between the U.S. and those Gulf partners that would respond as sovereign nations to this suggestion, a way to structure those arrangements in a more detailed and systematic and comprehensive fashion that is lacking from the status quo, in our opinion. And so that's sort of a very quick answer at the end of an hour and a half to one of the most important questions for me going forward, which is, what are the pros and cons of an alliance versus a partnership? in all the different areas that we've discussed.
Yes, other than the codification of something like that. I think another practical benefit is that it gives the United States flexibility in terms of its own attempt to redesign its posture, right? With such a commitment that is so clear and that is so formal, I think the United States will have more flexibility in terms of how it redesigns its force posture in the region. I'm not saying that it would give it license to reduce its forces, but it would certainly give it more flexibility. With something so clear that provides an ultimate security reassurance, I think the partners would be far less anxious about what the United States would do in the event of an attack.
And this gentleman's question from the State Department?
Regarding the
forces in political development.
well, it's no secret that the United States government, the Arab Gulf states, do not agree on everything that has to do with the internal threats facing those governments. And specifically, there's an issue, let's be very honest about that, there's an issue of how to label the Muslim Brotherhood. I think the United States is nowhere near labeling that movement as a terrorist movement, but some Arab Gulf states have. I'm not sure how they can move beyond that, but I think that with the other clear cases of terrorist organizations, whether it's the AQs and ISIS other types, there's clear room for further cooperation on that. And I think there was another aspect to the question, which was, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting it, beyond the further cooperation.
Well, I think the first part of my question had been about, political development being a core interest for the U.S.
Yes.
and how the U.S. would leverage the defense relationship to achieve those ends.
Right. I'm always careful to make the U.S. defense leverage contingent on them actually, pushing reform. But there certainly has to be some kind of relationship between the two, and it's up to, I think, the White House, in addition to its staff and the embassies in those countries, and obviously aided by their political advisors, to try to find the right balance, basically.
Well, speaking about messaging, I mean, one question which I do have, the administration, when it rolled out the pivot, did not say that it's going to abandon Europe, nor did it say it's going to abandon the Middle East.
No.
At all. It said, no, we're going to reduce, we have X number of troops here because we're engaged in operations. We're going to reduce them. We're going to be reducing the footprint, but we're not leaving the region, but we're going to increase relatively what our presence is in Asia. It was the same message toward Europe. And then the message was received a little bit like a teenager listening to their parents as, we're both going to be abandoned and we're going to die. It's sort of like, okay, I mean, does the government, does Washington overall have to do, how does Washington have to do a better job in messaging some of this stuff? Because it is painted with such broad brushes, how it gets, again, you were saying about the Twitter, how quickly that drives things, or perhaps a wrong thing comes out or an erroneous thing, and then that spreads like wildfire. What does Washington have to do to better communicate its messages so that they're not misunderstood? Because this stuff is complicated, it is nuanced, and it seems as though we're being somehow genetically or trained, Pavlovian electrode training to misunderstand stuff. I don't know. I mean, it's worrying for me as somebody in the press, because on some of this stuff, it has been clear. They have been saying some of this stuff. You can say the stuff that they've been saying that's wrong and say, hey, that's just BS. But what has to happen here in this sort of instantaneous cycle to more clearly telegraph your messages?
I mean, my two-part answer would be, one, there have been some rollouts, to use that word, of administration policies that have been well received and understood, and I think in those cases, the policy processes that led to those decisions and announcements were thoroughly coordinated and consulted with the Congress and our allies and partners in a way that some of the other decisions were not. And it's been reasonably well known that there was certain parties that preferred the term pivot in the government than others. Mm-hmm. And I think within a few weeks, the words changed to rebalance.
Yes.
And more artful suggestions such as that. The second part of my answer on this particular set of issues is just that, look, the United States still has the most capable military that can project power on a global basis, far greater capability and capacity than any other country on earth. And we shouldn't take questions of sequestration and other budget constraints too far and give others the sense that our capacity is much more diminished than it actually is. But that said, we now have demands, very significant military demands, in 3 different regions that we didn't have even 2 years ago, or that we didn't think we had and didn't have to plan on and resource 3 years ago. And this is demands in Asia, in the Middle East, and now again,
In Europe.
real demands in Europe. And I think that's one of the nearer term concerns that I have in terms of a potential military crisis. And so we're going to have to, walk, chew gum, and whatever the third thing is, all at the same time. And we're going to have to manage our limited military capabilities in much smarter ways and much more efficient and effective ways. And that's one of the reasons that led us to the recommendations in this report.
Bilal?
That's exactly right. I think the rebalancing has been misunderstood, but it's also real. It's not really an attempt to put a plan for an imminent departure from the Middle East. I think it's going to be taken much more seriously down the road. It's probably not today, but certainly it was not well received. Some of it has to do with communication, but there's some truth in it. I mean, I don't want to completely dismiss that there's an actually rebalancing effort. That too.
That's awful. At the end of an hour and a half, I didn't get that. With that, for those of us who were listening, we did get that. Barry, if for anybody who may have missed their question, thanks very, very much. Hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.